The pre-dawn light barely reached the wide glass walls of Hamilton International Airport, leaving the terminal bathed in the artificial glow of overhead panels. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee from the cafe tucked near the security line, mixed with the sterile tang of cleaning chemicals left behind by the overnight crew. TSA officer Mark Delaney leaned against the edge of his inspection table, scanning the growing line of passengers with the sharp, restless gaze of someone who had been up since 4 a.m. His Navy uniform was perfectly pressed, but there were faint shadows under his eyes, the kind that came from too many shifts in a row and too little patience left for small talk. The conveyor belt clattered softly as trays slid toward the X-ray scanner. Business travelers in pressed suits shuffled forward beside families juggling strollers and backpacks. Every few seconds, the low mechanical hum of the metal detector was broken by a short beep, followed by the sound of Velcro straps being undone for a secondary pat-down. Mark's gaze swept the line again, and then it caught on someone. Near the back, a tall black man in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit moved with quiet ease, pulling a sleek carry-on and wearing a leather laptop bag slung neatly over one shoulder. His polished shoes reflected the fluorescent light, and a silver watch gleamed briefly as he checked the time. He didn't fidget. He didn't glance nervously at the officers. He simply stood, waiting his turn, scanning the line ahead with the calm patience of someone used to airports. Still, something about him made Mark narrow his eyes. Maybe it was the way he carried himself. Too composed, too confident, like he didn't expect to be questioned. Mark had seen plenty of passengers who fit that mold, but ended up being more trouble than they looked. He leaned slightly toward his colleague, Officer Peterson, and murmured, "Keep an eye on the guy in the gray suit, back of the line." Peterson followed his gaze and gave a small nod. The line inched forward. The man placed his phone in a tray, removed his watch without being told, and set his laptop in a separate bin. His movements were precise, efficient, almost practiced. But to Mark, that didn't mean trustworthiness. If anything, it made him more curious. As the carry-on slid onto the conveyor, Mark's mind was already made up. He wasn't going to let this one pass through without a closer look. The low hum of the X-ray machine filled the air as the bins rolled through the scanner. On the monitor beside him, Mark watched the carry-on's contents appear in shades of blue and orange. Neat blocks of folded clothing, the solid outline of a laptop charger, a compact toiletry kit. Nothing unusual. Still, when the traveler stepped through the metal detector without a beep, Mark raised his hand. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening." The man stopped mid-step, turning to face him. His expression was calm, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice even, measured. "Random check," Mark said, keeping his tone official but firm. "Just over here, please." The traveler glanced briefly at the other passengers, moving through the checkpoint before nodding once. "Of course." His voice carried no protest, but the politeness felt deliberate, like someone reminding themselves to stay composed. Mark led him to the secondary inspection table, where the air always felt a little heavier. The faint smell of latex gloves lingered, and the hum of the crowd seemed more distant here, as if the rest of the airport had faded away. "Name?" Mark asked. "David Carter." "And your destination?" "Los Angeles." "Purpose of travel?" "Business meetings." Mark unzipped the carry-on, his hands moving methodically. Crisp dress shirts in muted blues and whites were stacked with military precision. Beneath them, a slim binder of documents sat perfectly aligned against the case's side. Mark flipped it open. Contracts, financial reports, and charts printed on heavy paper. Everything screamed legitimate, but that didn't make him stop. "You travel often?" Mark asked, glancing up briefly. "Yes." David's reply was clipped this time. Mark moved on to the laptop bag, placing the computer on the table and swabbing the outer surface for explosive residue. The test was standard procedure, but the silence between them made it feel like a challenge. David watched each movement carefully, his jaw tightening just slightly, when Mark lingered on his belongings longer than necessary. Mark told himself it was about doing the job thoroughly, but somewhere underneath, he could feel that his curiosity, maybe even suspicion, had taken the wheel. And David Carter seemed to sense it too. The secondary inspection area wasn't large, just a narrow stretch of counter space with a few plastic bins, a metal table, and a stool no one ever seemed to sit on. But right now, it felt like a spotlighted stage. Mark continued to go through David Carter's belongings with a thoroughness that was starting to feel less like procedure and more like persistence. Shirts were unfolded and shaken out before being folded back with less care. The toiletry kit was unzipped and each small bottle examined as if contraband might magically appear in the travel-sized shampoo. Peterson stepped in, holding a small gray swab device. "Sir, I'm going to need to run a surface test on your bag," he said. David's voice was calm, but his eyes had cooled. "Is that necessary? You've already checked everything." "Just routine," Peterson replied, though the glance he exchanged with Mark suggested they'd decided to keep going, no matter how clean the results. David placed his carry-on on the table without argument, but his jaw tightened as Peterson swabbed the handle and fed the sample into the machine. The test came back instantly, clear, but neither officer moved to end the screening. "Step over here for the full-body scanner, please," Mark said. David walked to the glass booth, standing on the footprints marked on the floor. The machine hummed softly as its panels slid around him, scanning every inch. Passengers passing by in the main line began to glance over, some curious, others wearing that mix of pity and discomfort reserved for situations that feel unfair but unchangeable. When the scan came back without a single alert, David stepped out. "Now, if there's nothing else," Mark cut him off. "Laptop case. Open it." David set the case on the table, unzipping it slowly. Inside was a sleek, high-end laptop, a charger wound neatly with a Velcro strap, and a thick leather notebook. Mark picked up the notebook, flipping through the pages without asking. Lines of handwriting filled the sheets. Meeting notes, project timelines, even sketches of what looked like airport terminal layouts. David's voice dropped lower, each word measured. "Are we still calling this random screening?" Mark didn't answer. The air between them was taut now, stretched thin by a mix of quiet defiance and unspoken accusation. Somewhere in the background, a suitcase thudded onto the conveyor. But here in this corner, the rest of the airport seemed to fade into silence. David closed his laptop case with deliberate care. "I'd like to be on my way now," he said, his tone still polite, but edged with steel. And though Mark didn't know it yet, those words were the beginning of the moment everything would turn. The air in the secondary inspection area felt heavy, almost static. David Carter stood with his carry-on closed but not yet taken, his gaze locked on Mark like he was measuring every second of the delay. Mark avoided meeting his eyes, focusing instead on rearranging the items he had already inspected, a pointless, time-wasting gesture he couldn't quite justify to himself. Then came the sound of quick, purposeful footsteps. From the far end of the checkpoint, a woman in a sharp navy blazer cut through the crowd like a blade. Her stride was brisk but not frantic, the kind of walk that said she had authority and was about to use it. Her short blonde hair was tucked neatly behind one ear, and a laminated badge bounced lightly against her hip with each step. Operations Director, Hamilton International Airport. "Officer Delaney," her voice was crisp, carrying just enough to make people in the nearby line look up. Mark turned, caught off guard by the urgency in her tone. "Ma'am?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes darted past him and landed squarely on David Carter. For a split second, her expression shifted. Recognition, followed immediately by something that looked like dread. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked, her voice low now but edged with steel. "Secondary inspection," Mark replied automatically, as if the words alone were enough to explain everything. Her gaze snapped back to him. "Do you have any idea who this is?" Mark glanced at David, then back at her. "Some frequent flyer," he said, trying for casual, but hearing the stiffness in his own voice. "This," she said, each word deliberate, "is David Carter. The David Carter. The newly appointed CEO of Aeroport Global, the company that owns and operates this entire airport, along with 24 others nationwide." Mark blinked, the name hitting him like a cold slap. The woman wasn't done. "He's here on an unannounced site visit to evaluate staff performance for a hidden camera internal report. And from what I've just walked in on," she stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air like a blade about to fall. A small muscle ticked in David's jaw. He hadn't spoken yet, but his eyes, calm, unwavering, were fixed on Mark in a way that felt far more dangerous than raised voices. In that instant, the checkpoint noise seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp thud of Mark's heartbeat in his ears. For a long, stretched moment, Mark just stood there, rooted to the spot. The hum of the X-ray machines, the shuffle of passengers moving through the checkpoint, even Peterson's quiet breathing, all of it seemed to fade into a muffled backdrop. David Carter still hadn't moved. He stood with one hand resting on the handle of his carry-on, his posture relaxed, but his gaze steady, almost unnervingly so. There was no raised voice, no visible anger, only a controlled silence that somehow felt heavier than if he had shouted. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but clear. "I'll need the names of everyone involved in this inspection." Mark opened his mouth, but his mind scrambled for words that didn't sound defensive or hollow. "Sir, David's tone sharpened, though the volume never rose. "This airport is part of a network that represents millions of passengers every year. What they experience here defines our brand. Today, I experienced profiling, unnecessary delays, and a lack of basic courtesy." Each word landed like a deliberate strike, calm but cutting. Peterson shifted his weight beside Mark, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked like he wanted to melt into the background, but there was no escaping the invisible line David's gaze had drawn around all three of them. Mark tried to speak again, to find some explanation, but the truth was that every reason he'd leaned on for the last 10 minutes suddenly felt paper thin. He'd made a call based on little more than instinct and a hunch. And now, standing in front of the man who literally ran the company that paid for the badge on his chest, that call looked less like diligence and more like bias. David took a slow breath, his eyes not leaving Mark's. "I don't need an apology. I need you to understand the damage done when the first contact a traveler has with our staff is suspicion rather than service." He reached for his bag, zipping it with precise, unhurried movements. The sound of the zipper seemed unusually loud in the small space. "I'll be including this in my report to the board," he added, the finality in his tone leaving no room for interpretation. And with that, he stepped away from the table. The crowd seemed to part naturally as he walked toward the concourse, his stride unbroken, the quiet authority of his presence lingering in the air long after he was gone. Mark remained where he was, the weight of what had just happened pressing down like a physical force. There was no undoing it, no rewinding, only the knowledge that every second of that encounter was now burned into the memory of a man who could change the course of his career with a single sentence. By the time Mark's shift neared its halfway point, the terminal felt different. Not in noise or movement, but in the way people looked at him. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Colleagues who had been chatting freely with him that morning now spoke in shorter sentences. Some avoided eye contact entirely. The news was already moving through the staff like a current in deep water, unseen but impossible to ignore. Mark tried to keep working as if nothing had happened. He processed passengers, scanned bags, gave instructions in his usual clipped tone. But every now and then, he caught a glimpse of Peterson a few lanes over, giving him that tight, uneasy glance. They hadn't spoken since David Carter had walked away, but the memory of the operations director's words still rang in Mark's ears. "Do you have any idea who this is?" It wasn't long before a voice came over his radio. "Officer Delaney, report to Office 3 and Administration immediately." The walk to the administrative wing felt longer than usual. The public noise of the terminal faded with each step, replaced by the muted hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional clack of a keyboard behind closed doors. When he reached Office 3, the door was already ajar. Inside sat Captain Ray Norris, head of airport security. His broad shoulders filled the chair, and his uniform jacket hung open in a way that somehow made him look both relaxed and intimidating. He gestured for Mark to sit. Mark closed the door behind him, the click of the latch sounding too loud in the stillness. "Delaney," Norris began, his voice low but firm, "I've had 3 calls about this morning. One from operations, one from corporate, and one from a board liaison I've never even spoken to before. Do you know why?" Mark swallowed. Because of the screening. Because, Norris said, leaning forward, you stopped and detained the CEO of the company that owns this airport. And you treated him like a suspected criminal for no documented reason. Mark's instinct was to defend himself, to talk about hunches, about vigilance, about doing his job thoroughly. But the words stuck. He knew deep down that those reasons wouldn't hold up under the weight of what had happened. I expect my officers to enforce security standards, Norris continued, but I also expect them to exercise judgment and to treat every passenger with respect. That means no assumptions, no bias, no making someone's trip harder because you have a feeling. Mark nodded once, the shame sitting heavy in his chest. There's going to be a report, Norris said. There's going to be retraining, and there's going to be an evaluation of whether you're still the right fit for this post. Mark left the office a few minutes later, walking back toward the checkpoint with the weight of the conversation pressing into his shoulders. The crowd moved around him as if nothing had changed, but for him, everything had. 2 weeks later, the training room in Hamilton International's administrative wing smelled faintly of stale coffee and new carpet. Rows of metal chairs faced a projector screen where bold white letters on a blue background read, Bias Awareness and Passenger Interaction Standards. Mark sat near the back, his uniform neatly pressed, a notepad balanced on his knee. Around him, other TSA officers, some younger, some veterans, scribbled notes or leaned back in their chairs with crossed arms. The trainer, a calm-voiced woman from the corporate compliance department, clicked through slides showing examples of both good and bad passenger interactions. Every so often, one example hit too close to home. A passenger pulled aside without clear cause, an officer whose questions felt more like an interrogation than standard protocol. Mark didn't need anyone to tell him which category he'd fallen into 2 weeks ago. After the session, he lingered in the room, packing his notes slowly. Peterson passed by, giving him a short nod. They hadn't talked much since the incident, but there was no hostility in the gesture, just the quiet acknowledgement of someone who'd seen the same lesson play out. The following Friday, Mark was back at his post at the checkpoint. The morning rush was in full swing. Families juggling boarding passes, business travelers scrolling through emails, tourists with overstuffed bags. The conveyor belts hummed, trays clattered, and voices overlapped in a low, constant murmur. Halfway through the line, he noticed a sharply dressed black man with a leather messenger bag. Months ago, that sight might have triggered the same flicker of suspicion that had set the whole disaster in motion. But this time, Mark's approach was different. He greeted the man with a polite, "Good morning, sir. How's your trip going so far?" His tone was even, professional, no edge, no presumption. The man smiled faintly, placing his belongings on the conveyor. "So far, so good. Thanks." Mark scanned the bins, sent them through the X-ray, and gave a simple nod as the traveler passed the metal detector without issue. No detours to secondary screening. No fishing for reasons. Just the job. Done right. As the man walked away toward the gates, Mark caught himself feeling something he hadn't expected. A small but genuine sense of relief. Not because he'd avoided trouble, but because for once, he'd made someone's journey a little easier instead of harder. In the corner of his mind, he wondered if David Carter would ever hear about moments like this. Probably not. But maybe that wasn't the point. Because the real change wasn't for David. It was for every traveler who would walk through his line from now on, and for himself.